a career destroyed, a corporation shaken, a brutal lesson in power, privilege, and consequences. At 40,000 feet, on a flight reserved for the world's elite, one woman made the biggest mistake of her life. Miranda Cole, the head flight attendant, thought she was untouchable, that she could decide who belonged and who didn't. So when a seemingly ordinary man, his wife, and their young daughter took their first-class seats, she made sure they knew they weren't welcome. She humiliated them, stripped them of their dignity, and then she threw them out. Passengers stayed silent. Her crew followed orders. And Miranda? She smirked, believing the power was hers. But power is an illusion, because the man she had just humiliated, Jack Sullivan, wasn't just any passenger. By the time the flight landed, her name would be ruined, her authority shattered, and she would learn the hard way. Some people aren't just passengers. Some people own the plane. Stay till the end to see just how fast karma strikes back. And if you love watching justice serve cold, smash that like button, drop a comment, and tell me where you're watching from. Have you ever felt the weight of every eye in the room, measuring you, doubting you, deciding where you do or don't belong? Jack Sullivan had, but he never expected it to happen at 35,000 feet. Jack adjusted his cufflinks as he stepped into the pristine, luxury-filled first-class cabin of Flight XJ-472. His wife, Rachel, walked beside him, her heels clicking lightly against the polished floor. Their 6-year-old daughter, Emily, held Rachel's hand with her other arm wrapped around a worn-out teddy bear, her favorite companion. It was supposed to be a simple flight, a routine business trip that Jack had turned into a short family getaway. After months of exhausting work, he figured a bit of luxury wouldn't hurt. They deserved it. The first-class cabin was immaculate, filled with plush leather seats, warm golden lighting, and an air of exclusivity. Passengers in tailored suits and designer dresses sipped champagne or tapped away on sleek laptops, barely acknowledging the new arrivals. Except one. At the far end of the cabin, Miranda Cole, the lead flight attendant, stood rigid, her uniform crisp and flawless. Her icy blue eyes swept over the family, lingering a second too long. There was a slight twitch at the corner of her mouth, a hesitation that Jack noticed immediately. As they moved toward their assigned seats, Jack felt the weight of her stare pressing against his back. He ignored it and helped Rachel settle Emily into her seat by the window. The little girl giggled, hugging her teddy close. "Mommy, look, the plane is so big." Emily's voice was filled with excitement. Rachel smiled, brushing her daughter's curly brown hair behind her ear. "I know, sweetheart. We're going to be flying very high today." Jack stowed their carry-ons in the overhead compartment, his movements calm but precise. Years of experience in high-pressure environments had trained him to sense tension before it fully manifested. And right now, something fell off. Just as he was about to sit, heels clicked sharply against the floor. "Excuse me." The voice was smooth but cold, laced with something Jack couldn't quite place. He turned to see Miranda standing beside them, clipboard in hand, her expression neutral yet somehow condescending. Rachel, sensing something, instinctively pulled Emily closer. "May I see your boarding passes?" Miranda's smile was tight, rehearsed. Jack raised an eyebrow but complied, retrieving the 3 first-class tickets from his jacket pocket. He handed them over without hesitation, his eyes locked onto hers. Miranda took the tickets, but instead of simply scanning them and returning them as she had done for every other passenger, she studied them. Too carefully, too long. Rachel frowned. "Is there a problem?" Miranda's lips pursed slightly before she spoke. These seemed to be incorrect. Jack's expression remained unreadable, but Rachel's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Miranda sighed, tilting her head as if explaining something to a child. "First class is a premium section. I just need to verify something with the front desk." Jack leaned back slightly in his seat, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp as a blade. "Verify what exactly?" His voice was polite, measured. Miranda didn't meet his eyes. "Please remain seated," she said, pivoting sharply and disappearing behind the curtain leading to the galley. Rachel turned to Jack, her voice hushed but urgent. "Jack, what is going on?" He exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "She's testing us." Rachel's jaw clenched. "Because of how we look?" Jack didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked toward the other passengers, who now whispered amongst themselves, glancing in their direction, judging, watching. Emily, oblivious to the tension, played with her teddy bear, her tiny feet swinging beneath her seat. Rachel sighed, rubbing her temple. "This doesn't feel right." Jack's lips curled slightly. "It isn't." Meanwhile, in the galley, Miranda was on the phone, her voice low but urgent. "I have a situation," she murmured, glancing toward the first-class cabin. "There's a family here, and I need confirmation on their reservation." The ground staff on the other end hesitated. "The Sullivan family? Their tickets were purchased weeks ago. Fully confirmed. Is there an issue?" Miranda's grip tightened around the phone. "No issue? Then why did they look so out of place?" No issue," she muttered, ending the call abruptly. But instead of returning with an apology, her expression hardened. She adjusted her posture, smoothed down her uniform, and took a deep breath before heading back toward first class. Jack saw her approaching. This time, her footsteps were quicker, her movements tenser. "Sir," Miranda began, her voice clipped, almost rehearsed. "I need you to step aside for a moment. There seems to be an error with your booking." Rachel's brows furrowed. "What kind of error?" Miranda avoided her gaze, gesturing toward the galley. "If you'd follow me, please." Jack hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He turned to Rachel, giving her a small, reassuring squeeze on the hand before rising. The murmurs around them grew louder. A middle-aged man across the aisle leaned slightly toward Rachel, his voice low. "Is everything all right?" Rachel forced a tight smile. "Just a mix-up, I think." But even as she spoke, she felt a cold dread settle in her chest. Emily tugged at Rachel's sleeve, her wide eyes full of confusion. "Mommy, where's Daddy going?" Rachel forced a smile. "Just to sort something out, sweetheart." But deep inside, she knew this was far from routine. Something was terribly wrong. Jack Sullivan was no stranger to confrontation. Over the years, he had learned to recognize power plays before they fully unfolded. And as he sat in seat 2A of first class, watching Miranda Cole march back toward him, he knew exactly what this was. A test. He had seen it before, the subtle, measured display of authority, the kind that wasn't about rules but about control. Miranda didn't just want to verify his seat. She wanted him to know that she could. She stopped beside him, her posture rigid, clipboard pressed tightly against her chest. Her lips curved slightly, but it wasn't a smile. It was a thin, stretched expression, manufactured politeness. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice smooth yet unnaturally stiff. "There seems to be a discrepancy with your booking." Rachel turned her head sharply. "Excuse me." Miranda barely glanced at her. Her focus was entirely on Jack. "I've checked our system, and there's an issue with your reservation. I need to confirm it with the front desk before takeoff," she said. Jack kept his expression unreadable. "Define issue." Miranda hesitated a fraction of a second, but he caught it. "There are certain protocols for first-class seating," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "I just need to make sure everything is in order." Rachel exhaled sharply. "You're saying our fully paid, confirmed tickets might somehow not be in order?" "I'm not saying that," Miranda countered, though her tone implied exactly that. "But I do need to follow procedure." Jack met her gaze. His silence stretched, deliberate and heavy. Rachel's fingers curled into a fist. She had seen this type of interaction before, never loud, never openly hostile, but calculated, just enough to make someone feel like they don't belong. Emily, still swinging her feet happily, looked up at her mother. "Mommy, is something wrong?" Rachel forced a smile, her heart twisting at the thought of her daughter, sensing the tension. "No, sweetheart." Jack finally spoke, his voice calm, controlled. "Let me get this straight, Miranda." He said her name on purpose, not Miss Cole, not ma'am. It was subtle, but the flicker in her eyes told him she noticed. "Our tickets were booked weeks ago, fully paid, and confirmed to check-in." Miranda nodded stiffly. "And you checked them before, then took them again?" Yet now, suddenly, there's a discrepancy? The words hung between them, thick with challenge. For the first time, Miranda broke eye contact. I just need a moment to verify, she repeated, her tone tighter than before. Jack leaned back, tapping his fingers lightly on the armrest. You do that. Miranda pursed her lips, turned on her heel, and strode off, disappearing behind the curtain leading to the galley. The moment she was gone, Rachel turned to Jack, voice low. She's lying. Jack nodded. Of course she is. Rachel's grip on Emily's hand tightened. Then why aren't you fighting this harder? Jack glanced at the curtain. Because I'm waiting to see how far she's willing to take it. Rachel's pulse quickened. Jack, he met her eyes, steady, reassuring, but alert. Trust me. Rachel took a breath and nodded, but deep inside, she knew this wasn't over. And Miranda wasn't done. Behind the curtain, Miranda grabbed the service phone and dialed. A male voice answered. Ground control. I need confirmation on a first-class booking, Miranda said, lowering her voice. Jack Sullivan and his family. There was a pause on the line. The Sullivans? The man repeated. Yes, Miranda said, tapping her nails against the counter. I need to know if their reservation was flagged for any reason. A few keystrokes clacked through the phone. Then, everything checks out. Their tickets were booked weeks ago, no issues. Miranda's fingers tightened around the phone. No mistakes in the system? Nope. Full fare, first class. Priority seating. Miranda ground her teeth together. No mistakes. No issues. Then why did they feel so out of place? She knew the answer. She just didn't want to say it out loud. Got it, she muttered, ending the call. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the phone. Then, slowly, she straightened her posture, smoothing down the front of her uniform. She had two choices. 1. Return to them, admit the mistake, and pretend it never happened. 2. Push forward and make the move anyway. The second option was riskier, but she didn't like losing. She set her shoulders, took a deep breath, and stepped back through the curtain. Jack was waiting. Rachel's jaw tightened the moment she saw Miranda return. Emily clutched her teddy bear closer. Miranda stopped beside them, her hands clasped in front of her. Sir, she said, her voice harder now. I need you to step aside for a moment. There seems to be an error with your booking. Rachel stiffened. Jack's eyes darkened, but his face remained calm, unreadable. What kind of error? He asked. Miranda kept her chin high. I need to confirm your seating arrangement. Please follow me. A slow silence followed. Passengers in adjacent seats turned, murmurs starting to ripple through the cabin. Jack studied her, his expression giving away nothing. Then, finally, he stood. Rachel reached for his hand, but he gave hers a light squeeze before stepping into the aisle. Miranda turned swiftly, leading him back toward the curtain. Passengers watched, curiosity shifting into quiet judgment. Rachel held Emily close, heart pounding. This was no longer a test. It was a verdict. Jack Sullivan was not a man who backed down. Yet here he was, standing in the narrow galley of Flight XJ-472, facing a woman who was determined to make an example out of him. Miranda Cole stood before him, arms crossed, chin lifted in defiance. Her expression was carefully controlled, but Jack could see it, the glint of triumph in her eyes. She thought she had won. She thought she had power over him. Jack exhaled slowly, keeping his stance relaxed but firm. He wasn't going to be baited into a loud, emotional reaction. That was exactly what Miranda wanted, a reason to call security, to have him forcibly removed. So he stayed calm, measured. Sir, Miranda said, her voice clipped, I've spoken with the front desk, and there is still a problem with your booking. Jack said nothing. He knew she was lying. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you and your family to relocate to the main cabin. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Jack's fingers curled slightly at his sides, but he kept his face unreadable. And if I refuse? His voice was quiet, but carried a weight that made Miranda hesitate. For the briefest moment, her confidence faltered. Then she straightened, squared her shoulders, and took a step closer. Then I'll have no choice but to involve security, she said. Jack tilted his head slightly. Security. Miranda held his gaze. Yes, sir. This is a simple matter. You can move now or we can escalate it. Jack didn't move. Behind Miranda, another flight attendant, Kate, shifted uncomfortably. She had been listening from the side, her expression a mixture of unease and disapproval. She knew what was happening here, but she said nothing. Jack took a slow breath. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back toward first class. Miranda followed, heels clicking sharply against the floor. Back in first class, Judgment Rachel stiffened when she saw Jack return. Emily, still hugging her teddy bear, looked up with innocent curiosity. But the rest of the cabin? They were watching. Jack could feel their eyes, the way their gazes flicked between him and Miranda, their whispers barely concealed. A few of them were curious. Some were amused. But most simply didn't care. Miranda stopped beside Jack's seat, her voice loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. Mr. Sullivan, she said, I'm going to have to insist. Rachel's eyes widened. You're really doing this? Miranda didn't even acknowledge her. Jack glanced around the cabin, noting the way some passengers shifted uncomfortably while others simply pretended not to hear. This was humiliation, carefully crafted and publicly displayed. Miranda wasn't just removing them, she was making an example out of them. Jack exhaled sharply through his nose. He could fight. He could stand his ground, demand to speak to the captain, refuse to move. But not here. Not now. Not in front of Emily. Jack turned to Rachel, speaking low enough that only she could hear. Get our things. Rachel's hands clenched into fists, but she nodded. She knew him well enough to understand. This wasn't surrender. This was strategy. Jack lifted Emily gently from her seat. The little girl frowned, confused. Daddy, why are we leaving? She whispered. Jack forced a smile. It's okay, sweetheart. Emily clutched her teddy bear tighter. Rachel gathered their bags, her movements tight and controlled. Silence fell over the cabin. Passengers watched as the Sullivan family stood, their presence towering even in retreat. Miranda smirked, stepping aside as Jack led his family down the aisle. And then a voice, low but clear. This is ridiculous. Jack didn't turn, but he heard it. Someone had spoken up. For the first time, a beat of hesitation flickered across Miranda's face. Jack glanced sideways. The older gentleman from earlier, the man in the sharp gray suit, was shaking his head in disapproval. But he didn't say anything else. Miranda ignored him, keeping her gaze on Jack. Rachel lifted her chin, refusing to let Miranda see any sign of hurt or embarrassment. But as they moved, Jack noticed something. Passengers avoided eye contact. They didn't agree with what was happening, but they also didn't object. They just wanted their flight to continue smoothly. They just wanted this to be someone else's problem. The Sullivan family reached the transition point between first class and economy. The change was instantaneous. Gone were the spacious leather seats, the hushed ambience, the polished air of exclusivity. Here, the aisles were tighter, the seats more cramped, the air thicker with noise and movement. The flight attendant at the front of economy blinked in surprise as she saw Miranda escorting the family over. They'll be seated here, Miranda said shortly, as if delivering a package she no longer wanted. Jack glanced at the cramped middle row seats, a stark contrast to the luxury they had just left behind. Rachel inhaled sharply but said nothing. Emily, sensing the tension, snuggled closer to Jack's chest. Miranda folded her arms. If there's anything else you need, feel free to ask. Jack slowly turned to look at her, meeting her gaze with unwavering calm. The kind of calm that unnerved people. The kind of calm that said, you've made a mistake. Miranda's smirk faltered. Jack didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Instead, he settled into his new seat, adjusting Emily in his lap, Rachel beside him, her posture rigid with silent fury. Miranda hesitated for a fraction of a second before spinning on her heel and walking back toward first class. Jack leaned back, and then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his pocket and sent a quick message. A single text. Rachel noticed. "Who did you text?" she whispered. Jack's lips curled slightly, but he didn't look away from the front of the plane. "Let's just say," he murmured, "the right people are watching now." Rachel's eyes widened, and for the first time since this nightmare began, hope flickered in her chest. The transition from first class to economy was not just about the seats. It was a fall from grace, a humiliation carefully designed. Jack Sullivan had seen power used like this before, not with loud commands or brute force, but with silent compliance, where people in control didn't need to raise their voice because they knew no one would stop them. And Miranda Cole? She knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted them to feel this. Jack and Rachel made their way down the tight, narrow aisle, Emily clinging to Jack's shoulder. Their seats were in the middle of the economy section, where the rows were cramped, the air was staler, the energy restless. The luxury of first class faded away behind them, a world they had paid for, but had been deemed unworthy of. And as if that insult wasn't enough, Miranda had one more card to play. The moment they reached their assigned seats, a low thud sounded from behind them. Jack turned just in time to see a flight attendant carelessly toss their luggage onto the floor. Rachel flinched, her lips parting in shock. Emily, still in Jack's arms, buried her face against his neck. The entire row of passengers in economy turned to look, some with curiosity, some with mild amusement, others with growing unease. Miranda, standing a few feet away, didn't even glance at the fallen luggage. Rachel's breath came sharp and fast. She wasn't a woman who lost control easily, but this was too much. Jack felt her tensing beside him, her hands curling into fists, and he acted before she could. Moving with slow precision, Jack knelt down and calmly picked up their belongings, one by one. No emotion, no reaction, nothing but controlled, deliberate movement. Rachel watched him, her fury barely contained. Miranda was waiting for them to snap. Jack wouldn't give her the satisfaction. He zipped the last suitcase, set it beside Rachel's seat, and settled Emily into her lap. Only then did he turn his gaze back to Miranda. Not angry, not defensive, just watching. Miranda's smirk faltered just slightly before she turned and walked back toward first class, heels clicking against the floor. She thought she had won, but the tide was already shifting. As Miranda disappeared, whispers rippled through the economy section. "That was unnecessary," a woman a few rows back muttered. "They had first-class seats, didn't they?" A man murmured. Jack pretended not to hear. Rachel, still furious, didn't even try. "Now they notice," she whispered harshly. Jack placed a steadying hand over hers. "Let them talk." Rachel exhaled sharply, looking away. Emily, sensing the tension, clutched her teddy bear. "Mommy, are we in trouble?" Rachel forced a smile, stroking her daughter's hair. "No, sweetheart. We're okay." Jack, however, wasn't smiling. He reached into his pocket and checked his phone. One unread message. Received. Standby. Rachel saw it, her pulse quickening. "Jack?" He put the phone away. "Just wait." Rachel studied him, then nodded. She knew that look. Jack wasn't done. Meanwhile, in first class, Miranda returned to her station, her confidence at an all-time high. She could still feel the passengers' stares from first class, but she didn't care. No one had openly challenged her. Sure, some of them had looked uncomfortable. A few had whispered about fairness. But at the end of the day, they all let it happen. She straightened her uniform, smoothing down her sleeves. Everything was back under control, or so she thought. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You really went through all that trouble?" Miranda turned. Kate, the younger flight attendant, stood near the beverage station, arms crossed. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Miranda wasn't fooled. "You have something to say, Kate?" Miranda asked, raising an eyebrow. Kate hesitated, then quieter. "That wasn't necessary." Miranda laughed lightly, shaking her head. "You're new to this, so let me explain something." She took a step closer. "There's a way things work in first class," she said smoothly. "And if you want to keep flying in this section, you'll learn fast." Kate didn't blink. "You mean making people feel like they don't belong?" Miranda's expression darkened. "That family was not first class," she said flatly. Kate stared at her, disgust flickering across her face. Then, quietly, she said, "You should check your messages." Miranda frowned. She reached for the tablet she used for in-flight communications and tapped the screen. Her inbox had a new message from the airline's corporate office. Subject line: "Passenger inquiry urgent." Miranda's stomach twisted. She opened it and froze. Back in economy. The first cracks appeared. Jack could feel it. Something was shifting. The momentum was turning. Passengers in economy were still murmuring about what they had just seen. Even some of the flight attendants were casting glances toward first class, as if waiting for something. Rachel sensed it too. "Something's happening," she whispered. Jack nodded, barely moving. "It's starting." Emily yawned against Rachel's shoulder, oblivious to the storm quietly brewing. Jack checked his phone again. Confirmed. Expect response soon. He tucked it away, leaning back into his too small economy seat. Rachel gave him a sideways glance. "What exactly did you do?" Jack simply smiled. And then, almost on cue, the intercom chimed. Jack Sullivan had faced power plays before. He had seen men and women in positions of authority use their influence like a weapon, cutting down those who couldn't fight back. But what was happening now? This wasn't just about control. It was about humiliation. And Miranda Cole was still playing her game. The seatbelt sign had been turned off for nearly 20 minutes. Flight attendants had already begun their rounds, distributing refreshments and hot towels to passengers in first class. And now they had reached economy. Jack sat beside Rachel and Emily, his broad frame barely fitting in the cramped seat. Rachel kept one arm around Emily, who had dozed off against her mother's side. Jack's eyes tracked every movement in the aisle, watching as passengers in front of them received their meals and drinks. A few rows up, a young woman was handed a bottle of water and a sandwich. Across the aisle, a businessman in a wrinkled suit was given a tray with hot food, a small dessert, and a cup of coffee. And then, the cart rolled to a stop beside Jack's row. A different flight attendant, Melissa, stood beside it, holding a tray with bottled water and snacks. She glanced at Jack, Rachel, and Emily, then hesitated. Something was wrong. Jack could see it in the way her shoulders stiffened, in the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the cart. He already knew what was coming, but he let it happen. Melissa cleared her throat. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, voice unnaturally stiff, "but it seems there was a mistake with your meal request." Rachel's head snapped up. "Excuse me." Melissa winced. "Your family's names aren't listed for meal service." Silence. Jack didn't move, didn't blink. Rachel sat up straighter. "That's not possible. We had meals in first class before we were moved." Melissa's grip on the cart tightened slightly, her jaw shifting. "I understand, ma'am, but..." Rachel's tone sharpened. "You understand? So fix it." Melissa hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. Jack already knew who she was looking at. And sure enough, standing a few feet away, arms crossed, watching with cool amusement, was Miranda. Rachel followed Melissa's gaze. When she saw Miranda, her entire body tensed. Jack saw too, the slight lift of Miranda's chin, the way her lips twitched upward in satisfaction. Jack's jaw tightened. Rachel turned to Jack, eyes blazing. "This is her." Jack reached over and placed a steadying hand on Rachel's arm. "I know." Emily stirred slightly in her sleep, shifting against Rachel's lap. Rachel's fingers curled into fists. Jack exhaled slowly before looking back at Melissa. "Are you telling me that somehow our meal requests, which were processed in first class, vanished from the system once we were moved?" Melissa swallowed hard. I don't have an answer for that, sir." Jack studied her face. She was uncomfortable. That much was clear. But she wasn't challenging the decision. She wasn't fighting for what was right. She was just complying. Jack let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Fine," he said smoothly. "Water then." Melissa visibly relaxed, grabbing 2 bottles of water and moving to set them down. "No," Miranda cut in from behind. Melissa froze. Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief. Miranda took a single step closer, her arms still crossed. We can't make exceptions. Rachel's breath hitched. Excuse me. Miranda turned to Melissa. You said their names weren't on the list, correct? Melissa looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. Yes, but then they don't receive service, Miranda said simply. Rachel shot up from her seat. Are you serious? This is a 6-hour flight. Miranda didn't even blink. That's airline policy. Rachel's hands trembled with rage. It wasn't airline policy when we were in first class. Miranda's smile was pure malice. Well, you're not in first class anymore. Rachel sucked in a sharp breath, her entire body shaking. Jack, still seated, reached up and gently touched her wrist. Rachel. She turned to him, fury in her eyes. Jack's expression was calm, too calm. He held her gaze, silently communicating what he needed her to understand. This wasn't the time. Rachel inhaled sharply, then slowly, deliberately, sank back into her seat. Jack finally looked at Miranda, and when he did, something in her smug expression faltered. He wasn't angry. He wasn't flustered. He was watching her, like a man who already knew how the story ended. Miranda cleared her throat, regaining her confidence. She turned to Melissa. Continue service. Melissa hesitated before rolling the cart forward, leaving the Sullivan family with nothing. Jack leaned back into his seat. Rachel sat beside him, fuming silently. And Emily, who was still half asleep, stirred slightly before whispering something soft against Rachel's shoulder. Mommy, I'm hungry. Rachel's eyes burned. Jack closed his hands into fists. Enough. Miranda strolled back to first class, feeling the weight of passengers' eyes on her. Some of them disapproved. Some of them were confused. But no one spoke up. They never did. She reached the galley and checked her tablet for flight updates. Then she saw it. A new message from the airline's executive team. Her stomach dropped. She tapped it open. The subject line was brief. Urgent. Passenger status review. Her pulse sped up. She opened it. Miranda, we've received a direct inquiry regarding a passenger issue on Flight XJ-472. Senior leadership has been notified. Expect a response soon. Executive Affairs. Miranda's fingers trembled slightly around the tablet. Direct inquiry? Senior leadership? She quickly checked the passenger manifest, her heart pounding. Then she saw it. For the first time, she saw Jack Sullivan's full file. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just a regular passenger. This was a mistake, a massive mistake, and Miranda had just made it 10 times worse. Miranda Cole had always prided herself on control. Control over the passengers. Control over the crew. Control over every aspect of her flights. But at 32,000 feet, that control was slipping through her fingers like fine grains of sand. And for the first time in her career, she felt it. Panic. Seated comfortably in first class, Richard Hale, a seasoned businessman in his 60s, had been watching Miranda since the moment she first approached the Sullivan family. He had seen it before, subtle discrimination wrapped in the guise of policy enforcement. And now, as Miranda stormed back into the galley, her movement stiff, her expression no longer confident but shaken, Richard knew something had changed. A woman across the aisle, a younger professional with dark-rimmed glasses, leaned toward him and whispered, "This doesn't feel right." Richard exhaled. It's not. They weren't the only ones. A few rows ahead, another passenger, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, looked toward the galley, where Miranda had disappeared. The way she treated that family, he murmured to his companion. Unacceptable. His companion, a blonde woman in her 40s, nodded, but her expression was doubtful. Are you going to say something? He hesitated. And that was the problem, wasn't it? No one ever did. Miranda paced, gripping the tablet in her hands so tightly her knuckles turned white. The email from corporate burned into her vision. Urgent. Passenger status review. Senior leadership has been notified. Expect a response soon. Her mind raced. Who had sent the complaint? Had someone in first class contacted the airline? No, it wasn't just a random complaint. This went straight to executive leadership. She checked the manifest again. Jack Sullivan. Her fingers hovered over the screen. For the first time, she scrolled down. Her stomach dropped. Executive priority passenger, special clearance level corporate oversight access. Her entire body went cold. This wasn't just a wealthy businessman. This was someone with real power. And she had just humiliated him in front of an entire flight. A lump formed in her throat. Breathe, Miranda. Think. She needed to get ahead of this. Before it exploded, Jack leaned back, his fingers tapping idly on his armrest. Rachel sat beside him, her posture rigid, barely holding in her anger. Emily, unaware of the growing storm, was doodling on a napkin with a pen Rachel had pulled from her purse. But Jack was waiting. Then a subtle buzz from his phone. A new message. Status confirmed. Next steps in motion. Jack smirked. Rachel saw it. Jack, she whispered. What did you do? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his head slightly, watching the cabin. The passengers around them were no longer oblivious. Some of them were shifting uncomfortably. A few were casting glances toward first class, toward the galley, toward Miranda. The air had changed. Jack sighed, stretching his arms slightly before murmuring, I made sure someone was paying attention. Rachel's pulse quickened. And then, as if on cue, the intercom chimed. A crackle of static, followed by a voice. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. The murmurs in the cabin quieted instantly. Jack's smirk widened. Rachel's nails dug into her seat. Miranda, still in the galley, froze mid-step. The captain continued. It has come to our attention that there has been a discrepancy regarding a passenger's seating arrangements. We are currently reviewing the situation with our corporate office. The air shifted. Jack felt it. Passengers began whispering again. Rachel's breath hitched. Miranda's entire body went rigid. Then the final blow. In the meantime, we ask that all flight attendants comply with standard airline policies regarding customer service. Rachel turned to Jack, eyes wide. That was for her. Jack exhaled slowly, watching the galley curtain. Yes, it was. Back in first class, Richard Hale and several other passengers exchanged looks. That wasn't just a routine announcement, Richard muttered. The younger woman across from him leaned forward. No, it wasn't. They turned toward Kate, the younger flight attendant, who had been hovering near the galley with an unreadable expression. She had heard the captain's words, and she knew exactly what they meant. Miranda was in trouble. Kate's lips twitched slightly. Good. Miranda felt like she was drowning. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She knew what the announcement meant. Corporate was watching. The captain was watching. Her next move had to be perfect. She squared her shoulders, adjusted her uniform, and stepped out of the galley. Jack saw her the moment she emerged. She didn't even look at him. Instead, she walked directly to Kate. Kate raised an eyebrow. Yes. Miranda's voice was controlled, but Kate could hear the strain beneath it. We need to regain control of this situation, Miranda said. Kate tilted her head. We. Miranda ignored the jab. Go to the captain. Tell him the situation is under control. There was just a misunderstanding. Kate blinked slowly. Then she smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was a kind of smile that said, I know exactly what you're doing. And then she said, no. Miranda's eyes snapped wide. Kate folded her arms. I think you should go explain this to the captain yourself. The words landed like a slap. For the first time, Miranda felt it slipping away completely. Control, power, and maybe her entire career. Her chest tightened. And then the phone in the galley rang. Kate's smile widened. You should probably get that. Miranda's stomach churned. She turned slowly, almost mechanically, and picked up the receiver. Miranda Cole speaking. A beat of silence. Then a voice. Miss Cole, this is Robert Langston, CEO of the airline. We need to talk. Now. Miranda's blood ran cold. For the first time since stepping onto Flight XJ-472, Miranda Cole felt completely powerless. The phone in her hand felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of her mistakes had finally settled onto her shoulders. And the voice on the other end? It belonged to Robert Langston, CEO of the airline. Not a supervisor. Not a regional manager. The CEO. Her stomach churned. This wasn't just a passenger complaint. This was something bigger. Something that could end her career. Miss Cole, Langston's voice was calm but firm, the kind of voice that didn't tolerate nonsense. I just received a direct call from our executive board. We need to discuss an incident involving a passenger in first class. Miranda swallowed hard. She knew exactly which passenger he meant. Sir, she began, grasping for control. There was a seating discrepancy. I was following protocol. A cold silence followed. Then Langston sighed sharply, the sound crackling through the receiver. Protocol, he repeated. Miranda flinched. You're telling me that protocol justifies forcibly removing an executive priority passenger from first class? Miranda's blood ran cold. Executive priority passenger. She had known Jack Sullivan had some level of status. But not this. Her. Pulse spiked. Langston's voice lowered dangerously. Did you even check his profile before you acted? Miranda's mouth went dry. No, Langston cut her off. You didn't. And now, we have a serious situation on our hands. Miranda gripped the counter, her vision blurring at the edges. Langston continued. As of right now, I'm instructing the captain to conduct an immediate review. You are to comply with all directives given. Her breath hitched. Sir, I can. No, Miranda. His voice was final. You can't. And then, the line went dead. Jack Sullivan didn't need to hear the conversation in the galley to know what had just happened. He could see it. The way Miranda stood frozen, gripping the phone as if it were a lifeline she had just lost. The way her posture stiffened when she realized she wasn't in control anymore. Jack didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply waited. Rachel, however, wasn't so patient. She leaned toward him, voice sharp and low. Jack, what the hell is happening? Jack exhaled, finally turning to face her. We're about to get our seats back. Rachel blinked. What? Jack's expression was calm, measured. I gave them enough rope, he said simply. Now they're hanging themselves with it. Rachel stared. She knew Jack was a strategist, a man who never acted without a plan. But this was something else. You played her, she whispered. Jack tilted his head slightly. No, he murmured. She played herself. And then, the galley curtain whipped open. Miranda stepped out, her movements too stiff, too rehearsed. But Jack saw the cracks. Her breathing was uneven. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides. She had spent the entire flight building herself up, convinced she was untouchable. And now, she was falling apart. She stopped in front of Jack's row, every eye in economy locked onto her. Passengers who had ignored the situation before were now fully tuned in. Rachel sat up straighter, her grip tightening on Emily's hand. Miranda opened her mouth, but hesitated. Jack said nothing, just waited. Finally, she forced the words out. Mr. Sullivan, she said stiffly, there's been a reassessment of your seating. Rachel's eyes narrowed. Jack simply raised an eyebrow. Miranda swallowed. You and your family will be reinstated to first class. Immediately. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Passengers glanced at each other, exchanging looks of confusion and curiosity. Rachel let out a breath of disbelief. Jack simply stood. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world. Miranda stepped back instinctively, and Jack saw it, the fear behind her eyes. She knew she had lost. Jack turned to Rachel, offering his hand. She took it without hesitation, gathering Emily in her arms. As they made their way toward first class, the tension in the air crackled like a live wire. Passengers in economy watched as the Sullivan family left their cramped seats behind. And Miranda stood frozen, watching them go, her career hanging in the balance. As Jack stepped back into first class, the atmosphere felt different. Gone was the smug exclusivity. Gone was the indifference of the passengers. Now, there was awareness, and in some cases, guilt. A few passengers who had remained silent earlier gave him small, apologetic nods. Others looked away, embarrassed. Jack didn't care. He led Rachel and Emily to their original seats, where the staff had already reset their trays, fluffed their pillows, and prepared their meals. A silent apology. Rachel settled Emily in her seat, brushing her fingers through the girl's hair. Jack sat down beside them, exhaling slowly. It was over. Or, at least, this part was. But then a voice. "Mr. Sullivan." Jack turned. A new flight attendant stood beside him, an older woman, poised and professional. "My name is Margaret Davis," she said. "I'm the head of cabin operations for this flight." Jack simply nodded. Margaret hesitated before continuing. "I've been informed that our corporate office is reviewing today's events." Jack tilted his head. Margaret swallowed. "And I've been asked to relay that our CEO would like to speak with you upon landing." Rachel's head snapped up. Jack's expression remained unreadable. But inside, he smiled. Miranda Cole sat in the galley, staring blankly at the service phone in her hands. Her mind was reeling, her body numb. The call from Robert Langston, CEO of the airline, had been brief and brutal. She had been given a direct order. And now, she was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, because she had just publicly humiliated a man she never should have crossed. She had belittled him, disrespected him, had him removed from first class in front of dozens of witnesses. And she had done it without ever checking his profile. Her biggest mistake wasn't what she had done. It was who she had done it to. And now, there was no way out. Her hands shaking, Miranda grabbed the crew tablet and reopened the passenger manifest. She scrolled back down to Jack Sullivan's name. This time, she didn't just skim the basic details. This time, she read everything. And the moment she saw it, her stomach twisted painfully. Jack Sullivan, Executive Priority Passenger Corporate Oversight Access, Primary Shareholder. East West Airlines. The words blared at her like a siren. Primary shareholder. Not a VIP customer. Not a wealthy businessman with connections. Not even an influencer who could cause PR damage. Jack Sullivan owned the airline. She had just thrown the owner of East West Airlines out of first class. Her chest tightened, her vision blurring at the edges. No. This couldn't be happening. Her entire body went cold. Jack wasn't just powerful. He had the authority to end her career with a single phone call. And she had treated him like a nobody. Miranda gasped quietly, sucking in a sharp breath. "Think, Miranda. Fix this." But it was too late. The damage was already done. And Jack Sullivan? He wasn't the type of man to let things go. Jack Sullivan sat in seat 2A, legs crossed, arms resting lightly on the armrests. He was completely at ease, as if the chaos of the last few hours had never happened. But Rachel knew better. She sat beside him, Emily curled up in her lap, her tiny chest rising and falling with sleep-filled breaths. Rachel leaned in slightly. "Jack." Jack's gaze flicked to her. Rachel exhaled slowly, her voice low but urgent. "I need you to tell me what's really happening." Jack studied her for a moment before speaking. "Miranda just found out who I am." Rachel's stomach flipped. She had suspected for a while now that Jack had set something in motion. But this? "You waited," she whispered, realization dawning. Jack's lips curled slightly. "I gave her every chance to do the right thing," he murmured. "She made her choice." Rachel shook her head in disbelief. "You let her walk into this blind." Jack shrugged. "She never bothered to check. That's not my fault." Rachel exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. "And now?" Jack's expression darkened just slightly. "Now I see how far this goes." Rachel watched him carefully. "You're not going to let this slide." Jack tilted his head slightly, his gaze calm but edged with something sharp. "Would you?" Rachel thought about it. Thought about how Miranda had smirked while forcing them out of their seats. How she had denied them food and water out of pure spite. How she had humiliated them in front of an entire flight. Her jaw tightened. "No," Jack nodded, pleased. Rachel glanced around first class, noticing how some passengers were stealing glances at them. They had all seen what happened. And now they were realizing their mistake. Rachel exhaled, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. Good, she murmured. Then let's see this through. Jack smiled faintly. They were in this together. Miranda was on autopilot. She moved stiffly through first class, her mind spinning, her pulse racing. She could feel the passengers' eyes on her. Whispers followed her as she walked. She could hear them. That family, was that the guy? She threw a shareholder out of first class? She's finished. The words dug into her like knives. But the final blow came when she stepped into the galley and found Kate standing there, arms crossed, waiting for her. Miranda stopped cold. Kate tilted her head slightly. Rough day. Miranda said nothing. Kate tapped a finger against the counter. Just got word from corporate, she said. They've opened an official investigation into your conduct. Miranda's stomach twisted violently. She gritted her teeth. I was following protocol. Kate smirked. That's funny, because the CEO himself just requested a direct conversation with Jack Sullivan. Miranda's breath caught. Kate leaned in slightly. You want to know the best part? Miranda didn't respond. Kate's smile widened. You did this to yourself. Miranda's vision blurred with fury. She whirled around and stormed back toward first class, only to find herself face to face with Jack Sullivan. Her breath hitched. Jack stood calmly, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. The entire first-class cabin went silent. Rachel turned slightly in her seat, watching with cool detachment. Jack's voice was low, even. You look like you have something to say. Miranda's pulse pounded in her ears. The weight of every bad decision she had made today crushed down on her all at once. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Jack simply held her gaze for a few seconds longer. Then softly, dangerously said, Sit down, Miranda. And for the first time since this flight began, she obeyed. Miranda Cole had spent years commanding respect in the air. But now, at 40,000 feet, in the first-class cabin of Flight XJ-472, she was nothing more than a woman trapped in her own downfall. And Jack Sullivan? He was the man holding the match. The moment Jack ordered her to sit, Miranda obeyed without question. Not because she respected him, not because she wanted to, but because, for the first time, she understood fear. Passengers in first class watched the scene unfold in hushed anticipation. Rachel, seated beside Jack, observed the moment with quiet satisfaction. Emily, still half asleep in her seat, shifted slightly, but she was blissfully unaware that the power balance in this flight had just flipped completely. Jack studied Miranda carefully. She sat with her back rigid, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her usual confidence? Gone. Her authority? Stripped away. But Jack wasn't here for petty revenge. This was about something bigger. And Miranda still had no idea how deep her mistake ran. The first-class phone rang. The sound was sharp, cutting through the tense silence. A nearby flight attendant, a woman Jack hadn't seen before, hurried to pick it up. She barely spoke before her eyes widened. Then she turned, her expression tight with nerves, and approached Jack's seat. Mr. Sullivan, she said carefully, the CEO of East West Airlines is on the line for you. The words rippled through the cabin like a shockwave. Passengers exchanged glances, whispers rising. He's really the owner? Holy hell, Miranda is done for. Jack simply nodded. The flight attendant extended the receiver to him. He took it calmly, pressing it to his ear. Jack Sullivan, he said smoothly. A voice, firm, composed, but undeniably tense, answered. Mr. Sullivan, this is Robert Langston. Even Miranda flinched at the name. Langston didn't waste time. I've been fully briefed on what happened aboard this flight, he said. I want to personally apologize for the mistreatment you and your family endured. Jack remained silent. Langston continued. The behavior of our crew, particularly Miss Cole, does not reflect the standards of East West Airlines. Effective immediately, we are conducting an official internal review of this incident. Jack finally spoke. An internal review, he said slowly, as if tasting the words. Langston hesitated. Yes, sir. Jack leaned back. Not good enough. Rachel's head snapped toward him. Miranda's breath hitched. Langston exhaled heavily. "What do you want?" Jack smirked slightly. He had been waiting for that question. Jack shifted, adjusting his grip on the phone. "This isn't just about me, Langston," he said. "It's about the system." Langston remained silent. Jack continued. "People like Miranda abuse their power because they believe they're untouchable." Miranda stiffened, her fists clenching. Jack ignored her. "If it happened to me, someone with the means to fight back, imagine how many others get mistreated and have no voice." Langston sighed. "What are you suggesting?" Jack's voice lowered dangerously. "I'm not suggesting anything." A pause. Then Jack delivered the final blow. "I want her gone." Miranda froze completely. Rachel exhaled slowly, watching Jack with something close to admiration. Langston's reply was immediate. "Done." Miranda's stomach plummeted. But Jack wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice cool and unyielding. "Not just fired," he clarified. "I want this made public." Miranda's eyes widened in horror. "You're proposing a public termination?" Langston asked, sounding almost reluctant. Jack smiled. "It's not a proposal." Langston hesitated. "Mr. Sullivan, you know what that means." "The media." Jack cut him off. "I know exactly what it means." Rachel watched, barely breathing. Jack's voice never wavered. "This needs to be a warning," he said, "to every airline, every customer service worker, every corporation that lets this happen behind closed doors." Langston exhaled sharply. "Understood." A pause. Then, the sound of papers shuffling. "I'll have my team draft a statement," Langston said. "Expect it to be issued within the hour." Jack nodded once. "Good." Then, without another word, he hung up. Silence stretched through the cabin. Rachel looked at Miranda, expecting her to lash out, to fight back. But she didn't. She just sat there. Her face was ashen, her breath shallow. She looked smaller than she had before, like a person who had just lost everything. And she had. Kate, standing near the galley, watched with a smirk of satisfaction. Miranda turned slightly, her lips parting as if to argue, to defend herself. But no words came. Jack simply watched her. Then, after a long pause, he finally said, "This didn't have to happen." Miranda swallowed hard. Jack's expression remained neutral, but his next words carried an undeniable finality. "But you made your choice." Miranda's eyes burned with emotion, but she didn't argue, because there was nothing left to say. Passengers whispered among themselves. A few still looked stunned, others satisfied. They had watched this unfold from the sidelines, hesitant to get involved. But now, as Miranda sat there, defeated, they understood what had just happened. Power had shifted. Jack had won. Rachel exhaled, tension finally leaving her shoulders. Emily stirred slightly, rubbing her eyes before looking up at her father. "Daddy," she murmured sleepily. Jack turned to her. "Yes, sweetheart." Emily yawned. "Are we home yet?" Rachel smiled faintly, brushing a hand through Emily's hair. "Almost," she whispered. Jack glanced toward the window, where the first hints of dawn stretched across the sky. This wasn't just a victory. It was a reckoning. And Miranda Cole? She had just become the cautionary tale. The moment Flight XJ-472 touched down, the tension in the cabin shifted. For most passengers, this was just the end of another flight. But for Miranda Cole, it was the end of everything. And for Jack Sullivan, it was just the beginning. As the seatbelt sign switched off, flight attendants sprang into motion, preparing for deboarding. But first, the two security officers waiting outside the cockpit stepped on board. Their eyes locked onto Miranda, who sat frozen in her seat, hands tightly clasped together. Rachel exhaled slowly, watching from across the aisle. Passengers around them pretended not to stare, but Jack could feel their curiosity. They had witnessed her abuse of power. Now they were about to witness the consequences. Kate, the younger flight attendant, stood near the galley, her expression carefully neutral. The lead officer took one step forward. "Miss Cole," he said evenly, "you need to come with us." Miranda didn't move at first. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She just sat there, as if delaying the moment would make it less real. Then, with trembling hands, she unbuckled her seatbelt and rose to her feet. Passengers watched in stunned silence as she walked down the aisle, flanked by the two officers. Some of them had once trusted her authority. Now they knew better. And Jack? Jack never looked away. Miranda reached the exit. Just before stepping off, she turned slightly, her gaze flicking back toward Jack. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him with defiance. She was looking at him with regret. Jack simply held her stare, his expression unreadable. Then she was gone. A ripple of whispers followed her departure, but Jack ignored them. He had bigger things to handle. Jack stepped into the private airport lounge, where a man in a tailored Navy suit was already waiting for him. Robert Langston, CEO of East-West Airlines. Langston turned, extending a hand. Mr. Sullivan. Jack shook it firmly. Let's talk. They sat across from each other, the room's floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac. Langston folded his hands together, getting straight to the point. I don't need to tell you how badly this situation has damaged us. Jack leaned back. No, you don't. Langston sighed. Public relations is already working on a full statement. We'll ensure Miranda Cole is permanently blacklisted from the airline industry. Jack tilted his head slightly. That's a start. Langston hesitated. What else do you want? Jack's gaze darkened. I want change. Langston exhaled, rubbing his temple. Be specific. Jack's voice remained calm, unwavering. New mandatory training for all employees, especially flight attendants, on bias and customer treatment. Langston nodded. Done. Jack continued. I want stricter oversight on passenger removals. No more arbitrary decisions based on personal bias. Langston hesitated slightly, then nodded again. Jack leaned forward. And I want a public commitment from you personally that East-West Airlines will hold its employees accountable when they abuse their authority. Langston's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about fixing one mistake. Jack was forcing him to change the entire system. Finally, the CEO nodded. You have my word. Jack studied him for a moment, then stood. Langston followed. Jack extended a hand. Langston shook it. It was done. And just like that, the game had changed forever. As Jack walked back through the airport, Rachel and Emily waited for him near baggage claim. Emily spotted him first. Daddy, she called, running toward him. Jack caught her easily, lifting her into his arms. Rachel smiled softly. All set. Jack nodded. All set. Rachel studied him carefully. Are you satisfied? Jack glanced toward the nearest airport monitor, where a news headline was already flashing. Airline scandal. CEO confirms sweeping policy changes after passenger incident. Jack smirked. He didn't need revenge. He had gotten something better. Change. His voice was quiet but resolute. They'll never forget this flight. Rachel looped her arm through his. Neither will we. Jack exhaled, holding Emily close. This wasn't about power. It wasn't about winning a battle. It was about making sure no one else ever had to fight it. As they walked toward the exit, Emily yawned against Jack's shoulder. Can we go home now? She mumbled sleepily. Jack pressed a kiss to her forehead. Yeah, sweetheart, he murmured. We're going home. In the weeks that followed, the impact of Flight XJ-472 spread like wildfire. East-West Airlines implemented sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training, stricter policies on passenger removals, and increased accountability for flight crews. Other airlines took notice. The story made headlines, sparking national conversations about power abuse in the airline industry. And Miranda Cole? She was never seen on another flight again. Her name became a cautionary tale, a reminder that power, when abused, always comes with a price. The end. What do you think? Did Miranda get what she deserved? Should corporations be held more accountable for how they treat their customers? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. If you love seeing justice served, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more stories where power gets put in its place. Because at the end of the day, respect isn't a privilege, it's a right.